Don't skip. Your soulmate secretly tested your honesty and broke down in tears when they found out. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now. Because your soulmate secretly tested your honesty, and what they discovered changed everything. And listen to this, you had absolutely no idea it was happening. There was no warning, no dramatic confrontation, no obvious question designed to reveal your character. If anything, the moment looked completely ordinary. It looked like one of those everyday situations that people forget about within minutes. But for them, it was anything but ordinary. For them, it was important. For them, it carried meaning. Because beneath the surface of that simple moment, they were searching for an answer they had been carrying inside for a very long time. They were searching for the truth about you. And your heart needs this right now because this wasn't about suspicion in the way most people would imagine. It wasn't about trying to catch you making a mistake. It wasn't about proving you wrong. It wasn't about setting a trap. It was about understanding whether what they felt about you could be trusted. Because the truth is, they had reached a point where their feelings were becoming difficult to ignore. They had started noticing you differently. They had started paying attention to the way you spoke, the way you treated people, the way your presence affected them. And those feelings made them hopeful. But hope can be frightening when someone has been disappointed before. And listen to this, they carried experiences from the past that taught them to be careful. They had trusted people before. They had believed promises before. They had listened to words that sounded beautiful but eventually turned out to mean very little. And because of those experiences, they built walls around their heart. Not visible walls. Not the kind people talk about openly. Quiet walls. Invisible walls. The kind that make someone hesitate even when something feels right. The kind that make someone question what they see even when the evidence is standing directly in front of them. And your heart needs this right now because those walls were the reason the test happened. They weren't testing your intelligence. They weren't testing your loyalty. They weren't testing whether you would say the perfect thing. They were testing something much deeper. They were testing your authenticity. They wanted to know who you were when you weren't trying to impress anyone. They wanted to know whether your actions matched your words when no reward was waiting at the end. They wanted to know whether your honesty was real or whether it only appeared when it was convenient. And listen to this. The moment arrived without you even noticing. It came disguised as something ordinary. Maybe a conversation. Maybe a situation where you had a choice. Maybe a moment where nobody would have blamed you for taking an easier path. Maybe a moment where nobody would have even noticed if you had chosen differently. But they noticed. They were paying attention. Quietly. Carefully. Watching without interfering. Observing without revealing what they were really looking for. And your heart needs this right now because what happened next surprised them. At first, they expected to find inconsistency. Not because they believed you were dishonest, but because experience had taught them to expect disappointment. Part of them believed there had to be something hidden beneath the surface. Something they hadn't seen yet. Some contradiction. Some flaw in the story. Some evidence that would justify keeping their walls intact. But listen to this. That evidence never appeared. Instead, they saw something they weren't prepared for. They saw consistency. They saw honesty. They saw integrity. They saw someone behaving the same way whether anyone was watching or not. And your heart needs this right now because that realization didn't arrive all at once. It happened gradually. Piece by piece. Moment by moment. The more they observed, the more difficult it became to hold on to their doubts. Every action you took seemed to reinforce the same truth. Every response seemed to confirm the same thing. Every small decision seemed to point toward the same conclusion. You were being yourself. Not performing. Not pretending. Not creating an image. Just being yourself. And listen to this, that was the part that affected them the most. Because honesty is easy when there is something to gain. Honesty is easy when everyone is watching. Honesty is easy when it improves someone's reputation. But honesty becomes meaningful when nobody is keeping score. When nobody is handing out rewards. When nobody is demanding proof. And that is exactly the version of honesty they saw in you. And your heart needs this right now because as they continued watching, something inside them started changing. The doubts they carried began losing their power. The fears they had protected for so long started feeling less convincing. The stories they had told themselves about why they needed to stay guarded began falling apart one by one. And listen to this, they didn't expect that. They expected the test to reveal something about you. Instead, it revealed something about them. It revealed how much fear they had been carrying. It revealed how many walls they had built. It revealed how long they had been protecting themselves from the possibility of trusting someone again. And your heart needs this right now because that's when the emotional part began. Not because of anything dramatic. Not because of a shocking discovery. But because they realized they had finally encountered something genuine. Something real. Something that wasn't asking them to guess. Something that wasn't forcing them to wonder. Something that wasn't hiding behind confusion. And for someone who had spent so much time expecting disappointment, that realization felt overwhelming. And listen to this, they may have replayed the moment over and over in their mind afterward. They may have gone back through every detail. Every word. Every action. Every choice you made. Looking for something they missed. Looking for some hidden contradiction. Looking for a reason to return to their old doubts. But every time they revisited it, the same truth remained. You were honest. Not perfect. Not flawless. Not superhuman. Just genuine. And your heart needs this right now because genuine people are rare. Not because they don't exist. But because they are difficult to recognize when someone has spent years expecting the opposite. And that recognition hit them harder than they ever expected. Because suddenly they weren't just looking at you. They were looking at themselves. Looking at their fears. Looking at their defenses. Looking at all the reasons they had held back. And realizing that maybe, just maybe, those reasons no longer made sense. And listen to this, that realization opened something inside them. Something they had kept closed for a very long time. The possibility of trust. The possibility of vulnerability. The possibility that not everyone is hiding something. The possibility that what they felt about you wasn't foolish after all. And your heart needs this right now because that's why this moment mattered so much. It wasn't really about the test. It wasn't really about the answer. It was about what the answer represented. Hope. Trust. Authenticity. Truth. Things they thought had become difficult to find. And when they finally realized what they were seeing, when they finally allowed themselves to believe it, the emotional weight of that realization became impossible to ignore. Because sometimes tears don't come from pain. Sometimes tears come from relief. The relief of finally finding something real after preparing yourself for disappointment. The relief of realizing your instincts were right. The relief of seeing honesty where you expected confusion. And your heart needs this right now because that is the truth of what happened. The test ended. The answer became clear. The doubts lost their power. And something inside them changed forever. Because what they discovered wasn't just your honesty. What they discovered was a reason to believe again. And once someone discovers that, nothing feels quite the same afterward. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because what happened after they decided to quietly observe you was not what they expected at all. And listen to this, when they first created that small test, they believed they would find answers quickly. They thought they would see something that confirmed their doubts or justified the emotional distance they had been maintaining. But instead, they found themselves paying closer attention than they ever intended. What began as a simple attempt to understand you slowly turned into something much deeper. Because your heart needs this right now, the more they watched, the more they realized they weren't looking for mistakes anymore. They were looking for consistency. They were looking for signs that what they felt about you could be trusted. And every time they looked, they found the same thing. They found someone whose words matched their actions. Someone whose behavior remained steady whether attention was on them or not. Someone who didn't seem to change depending on who was present or what could be gained from a situation. And listen to this, they started noticing details most people would overlook. Small moments. Tiny decisions. Things that seemed insignificant on the surface but carried meaning when viewed together. The way you responded when honesty was inconvenient. The way you handled situations where nobody would have blamed you for taking an easier path. The way you stayed true to your values even when there was no reward waiting for you. And your heart needs this right now because those moments began to create a picture they could no longer ignore. One moment by itself might not have meant much. 2 moments might have been coincidence. But after enough time, after enough observations, after enough proof collected through ordinary experiences, a pattern began to emerge. And that pattern told a story far different from the one they had prepared themselves to find. And listen to this, every time they expected to discover inconsistency, they discovered sincerity. Every time they expected to find a reason to stay guarded, they found a reason to lower their defenses instead. And your heart needs this right now because this was becoming uncomfortable for them. Not because anything was wrong, but because the truth they were finding challenged beliefs they had held for a very long time. They had convinced themselves that trust should be given carefully. They had convinced themselves that people always reveal hidden motives eventually. They had convinced themselves that disappointment was inevitable if they allowed themselves to believe too much. But the evidence they were gathering didn't support those beliefs anymore. And listen to this, they began replaying conversations in their mind. Not because they were searching for flaws, but because they were trying to understand why your honesty felt different. Why your authenticity felt so natural. Why your actions carried a sense of consistency they rarely encountered. And your heart needs this right now because they slowly realized something important. You weren't trying to convince anyone that you were genuine. You weren't performing honesty. You weren't creating a carefully designed image. You were simply living according to who you are. And that difference mattered more than they could explain. Because genuine honesty doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It quietly reveals itself through repeated actions over time. And listen to this, the more they understood that, the harder it became to maintain emotional distance. Because every wall they had built depended on doubt. Every defense they relied upon depended on uncertainty. Every reason they had for staying guarded depended on the belief that eventually something would go wrong. And your heart needs this right now because those reasons were beginning to disappear. One by one. Slowly but undeniably. The truth they were discovering wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shocking. It was steady. And sometimes steady truth is more powerful than any dramatic revelation because it cannot be dismissed as emotion or coincidence. And listen to this, they may have found themselves thinking about you when they weren't expecting to. Not because they were trying to analyze you anymore, but because they couldn't stop reflecting on what they had learned. They started asking different questions. Instead of wondering whether you were honest, they began wondering why your honesty affected them so deeply. Instead of questioning your character, they began questioning their own fears. And your heart needs this right now because that shift changed everything. The focus was no longer on proving who you were. The focus had moved to understanding why they had struggled so much to trust what was right in front of them. And listen to this, that's when the emotional weight began building. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But gradually. Every new realization added another layer. Every moment of understanding made the truth harder to ignore. And your heart needs this right now because they were beginning to realize that they had spent so much time protecting themselves from disappointment that they had almost missed something genuine. They had spent so much energy searching for reasons to be cautious that they nearly overlooked reasons to believe. And listen to this. That realization carried emotion they weren't prepared for. Because when someone discovers something authentic after expecting the opposite, it doesn't just change their opinion. It changes their perspective. It changes how they see people. It changes how they see themselves. And your heart needs this right now because the truth they found in you was beginning to affect parts of them they thought were permanently closed. Hope. Trust. Vulnerability. Possibility. Things they had learned to keep at a distance suddenly felt real again. And listen to this, they may have tried to remain logical about it. They may have told themselves they were overthinking. They may have tried to explain away the significance of what they were feeling. But every attempt to minimize it failed. Because the truth remained. The pattern remained. The consistency remained. And your heart needs this right now because eventually they reached a point where they could no longer deny what they had discovered. The evidence was too clear. The realization was too strong. The truth was too obvious. And that truth was simple. You were exactly who you appeared to be. Not perfect. Not flawless. Not impossible. Just real. And sometimes finding something real in a world that often feels uncertain is enough to change someone's entire perspective. That is the realization they were moving toward. That is the understanding that was growing inside them. And that understanding was preparing them for the emotional moment that would follow, the moment when all those doubts, fears, and defenses would finally begin to fall apart. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because what happened next was the moment everything changed. Up until this point, they had been observing, questioning, analyzing, and trying to understand what was true. They had been collecting small pieces of evidence without fully realizing how much those pieces were affecting them. But then something shifted. And listen to this, it wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't a shocking revelation. It wasn't one single moment that changed everything overnight. Instead, it was the realization that all those small moments, all those observations, all those tiny details they had been paying attention to were pointing toward the same truth. And your heart needs this right now because once they saw that pattern clearly, they couldn't unsee it. Once they understood what they were really looking at, there was no way to go back to the doubts they had been carrying before. And listen to this, they had expected to find complexity. They had expected to find contradictions. They had expected to discover something that would justify their fears. But what they found instead was simplicity. Not the kind of simplicity that lacks depth, but the kind that comes from authenticity. The kind that exists when someone is the same person behind closed doors that they are in public. The kind that exists when someone's actions naturally reflect their values without needing to be forced. And your heart needs this right now because authenticity is powerful precisely because it doesn't try to be powerful. It simply exists. And the more they realized that about you, the more emotional the discovery became. And listen to this, there came a moment when they stopped looking for evidence and started accepting it. A moment when they stopped questioning whether your honesty was real and started understanding that it had been real all along. And that moment carried more weight than they expected. Because accepting the truth meant confronting everything that had prevented them from seeing it sooner. It meant confronting their fears, their doubts, their past disappointments, their tendency to expect the worst even when the best was standing right in front of them. And your heart needs this right now because that realization didn't just change the way they saw you. It changed the way they saw themselves. They began asking difficult questions. Questions they had avoided for a long time. Why had they been so afraid to trust? Why had they assumed disappointment was inevitable? Why had they spent so much energy preparing for heartbreak that they almost overlooked something genuine? And listen to this, those questions didn't have easy answers. Because sometimes the barriers we build around our hearts become so familiar that we stop noticing they're there. Sometimes we become so accustomed to protecting ourselves that we forget what openness feels like. And your heart needs this right now because that's exactly what they were realizing. They weren't just discovering your honesty. They were discovering how much fear they had been carrying. And listen to this, that realization hit them harder than anything they had expected. Because for the first time in a long time, they found themselves facing something they couldn't explain away. They couldn't dismiss your consistency as coincidence. They couldn't label your authenticity as an act. They couldn't convince themselves there was some hidden motive waiting to be uncovered. Every explanation they had relied on before simply stopped working. And your heart needs this right now because when old beliefs stop working, something new has to take their place. And what was taking their place was trust. Not complete trust all at once. Not blind trust. Not reckless trust. But the beginning of real trust. The kind that grows from evidence. The kind that grows from observation. The kind that grows when someone repeatedly shows you who they are. And listen to this, that was the moment the emotional impact truly began. Because trust isn't just a thought. It's a feeling. It's a decision. It's a risk. And realizing that someone might actually deserve that trust can be overwhelming when you've spent years convincing yourself to be careful. And your heart needs this right now because they were no longer just evaluating you. They were feeling the consequences of what they had discovered. They started remembering every moment they had doubted. Every moment they had questioned. Every moment they had hesitated. And suddenly those moments looked different. Not because the past had changed, but because their perspective had. And listen to this, there is something deeply emotional about realizing you were wrong about your fears. Not wrong about being cautious. Not wrong about protecting yourself. But wrong about assuming that every person would eventually prove your fears correct. And your heart needs this right now because that realization created a crack in the walls they had built. A small crack at first. Barely noticeable. But once a crack appears, light begins to enter. And that's what happened. Light entered. Hope entered. Possibility entered. And emotions they had been keeping locked away for a very long time began rising to the surface. And listen to this, they may have found themselves sitting alone afterward, replaying everything in their mind. Going back through conversations. Remembering specific moments. Reflecting on things they hadn't fully appreciated before. And with every memory, the truth became stronger. The understanding became clearer. The emotional weight became heavier. And your heart needs this right now because they weren't crying because of sadness. They weren't emotional because something bad had happened. They were emotional because something real had happened. For someone who had spent so long expecting disappointment, they found sincerity. For someone who had spent so long expecting inconsistency, they found reliability. For someone who had spent so long expecting masks, they found authenticity. And listen to this, experiences like that affect people deeply. Because they challenge stories we've been telling ourselves for years. They force us to reconsider what we believe is possible. They remind us that not every chapter has to end the same way the previous ones did. And your heart needs this right now because that is exactly what they were beginning to understand. The person they had quietly tested. The person they had carefully observed. The person they had been trying to understand. Had become the reason they were questioning their own fears. And that realization carried enormous emotional weight. And listen to this. As everything finally connected in their mind, as all the pieces came together, as the truth became impossible to deny, they felt something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel for a very long time. Relief. Relief that honesty still exists. Relief that authenticity still exists. Relief that trust might actually be possible. Relief that maybe, just maybe, their heart had recognized something real before their mind was ready to accept it. And your heart needs this right now because that relief was so powerful that it overwhelmed every defense they had left. The walls weakened. The doubts lost their strength. The fears stopped feeling convincing. And in their place came understanding. A deep understanding. A life-changing understanding. The understanding that what they discovered wasn't just honesty. It was proof that genuine people still exist. And that realization was powerful enough to change everything. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because after everything they discovered, after all the doubts they carried began falling apart, after they finally accepted the truth they had been resisting for so long, something happened that they never expected. And listen to this, it wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't a sudden confession. It wasn't a moment anyone else would have noticed. It happened quietly. Privately. In a moment where they were finally alone with their thoughts and unable to distract themselves from what they now understood. And your heart needs this right now because for the first time, they stopped analyzing. They stopped questioning. They stopped searching for hidden meanings. Instead, they allowed themselves to simply feel. And that is when everything they had been holding inside began rising to the surface. And listen to this. People often think tears come from sadness, but sometimes they come from something completely different. Sometimes they come from relief. Sometimes they come from realization. Sometimes they come from carrying something heavy for so long that the moment you finally put it down, your heart doesn't know how else to respond. And your heart needs this right now because that is exactly where they found themselves. They had spent so much time being cautious. So much time protecting themselves. So much time preparing for disappointment before it even happened. And now, suddenly, all those defenses felt unnecessary. All those fears felt smaller. All those worst-case scenarios they had imagined no longer seemed real. And that realization hit them with a force they never saw coming. And listen to this, they started thinking about every moment they doubted. Every time they questioned your intentions. Every time they convinced themselves not to trust what they were seeing. Every time they chose caution over belief. And your heart needs this right now because looking back on those moments created an emotional storm inside them. Not because they regretted being careful, but because they realized how close they came to missing something genuine. How close they came to letting fear speak louder than truth. How close they came to convincing themselves that something real wasn't real at all. And listen to this. As those realizations continued unfolding, another feeling began appearing underneath them. Gratitude. Deep gratitude. Because they realized that despite all their doubts, despite all their hesitation, despite all the emotional walls they had built, the truth never changed. Your honesty remained the same. Your authenticity remained the same. Your character remained the same. You didn't become genuine because they tested you. You were genuine before the test ever existed. And your heart needs this right now because that understanding affected them more deeply than they can explain. It showed them that real integrity doesn't depend on being watched. It doesn't depend on receiving recognition. It doesn't depend on getting credit. It simply exists. And listen to this, that realization created something inside them that felt almost overwhelming. Because suddenly they weren't just looking at your honesty. They were looking at the possibility of trust. The possibility of connection. The possibility that not every story has to end in disappointment. And for someone who had spent years convincing themselves to be careful, that possibility felt enormous. It felt emotional. It felt vulnerable. It felt like standing in front of a door they had kept locked for a very long time and realizing they finally wanted to open it. And your heart needs this right now because that is when the tears came. Not from weakness. Not from pain. Not from heartbreak. But from release. The release of years of fear. The release of old disappointments. The release of expectations that no longer served them. The release of emotional weight they didn't even realize they were carrying until it finally began leaving them. And listen to this, those tears weren't about the test anymore. The test had already been answered. The truth had already been revealed. What they were feeling now was the impact of that truth. For the first time in a long time, they weren't preparing for something to go wrong. For the first time in a long time, they weren't searching for hidden problems. For the first time in a long time, they weren't waiting for disappointment to arrive. Instead, they were looking at something genuine and allowing themselves to believe it. And your heart needs this right now because belief can be one of the most emotional experiences a person has after spending years protecting themselves from it. It requires vulnerability. It requires courage. It requires letting go of old stories and making room for new possibilities. And that is exactly what they were doing. And listen to this, as the emotion settled, as the tears slowly stopped, as the realization became part of them instead of something they were trying to understand, a new sense of clarity began taking its place. A calmness. A certainty. A quiet understanding that they could no longer deny. They knew what they had discovered. They knew what it meant. And most importantly, they knew that they would never see you the same way again. Because the person they tested wasn't the person they expected to find. The person they discovered was someone even more genuine than they imagined. And that truth changed everything. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because after everything they discovered, after every doubt collapsed, after every fear lost its hold, after every tear finally carried away the weight they had been holding for so long, they reached a place they never expected to reach. And listen to this, they are no longer standing where they once stood. They are no longer looking at you through uncertainty. They are no longer questioning your intentions, analyzing your actions, or searching for hidden meanings beneath your words. That chapter is over. The test has ended. The answers have been found. And your heart needs this right now because what remains is something much stronger than curiosity. What remains is understanding. Real understanding. The kind that can only come after someone sees the truth with their own eyes and experiences it with their own heart. And listen to this. They now understand that honesty is not something that can be forced, rehearsed, or performed forever. Genuine honesty reveals itself naturally over time. It appears in the small choices people make when nobody is watching. It appears in moments where there is nothing to gain and no reason to pretend. And your heart needs this right now because that is exactly what they saw in you. They saw consistency. They saw integrity. They saw someone who remained true to themselves regardless of circumstances. And once that realization became clear, it changed the entire foundation of how they see this connection. And listen to this, they may still be processing everything. They may still be sitting with the emotional impact of what they discovered. Because sometimes the most life-changing realizations are not the loudest ones. Sometimes they arrive quietly and continue unfolding long after the moment itself has passed. And your heart needs this right now because what they discovered about you is continuing to grow inside them. It is influencing how they think. It is influencing how they feel. It is influencing the choices they are beginning to consider. Because now they are no longer asking themselves whether they can trust what they see. They are asking themselves what to do with that truth. And listen to this, this is where everything begins to shift. Not because of a dramatic event. Not because of a sudden confession. But because certainty creates movement. Once someone becomes certain about something meaningful, they naturally begin moving toward it instead of away from it. And your heart needs this right now because that movement has already started inside them. Even if you cannot see it yet. Even if nothing has changed on the surface. Internally, something is very different now. The walls are lower. The fears are weaker. The doubts are quieter. And the truth is stronger than it has ever been before. And now this is where it shifts to you. Because this story was never really about being tested. It was never really about proving yourself. The truth is, you didn't know the test was happening. You weren't trying to convince anyone of anything. You simply showed up as yourself. And your heart needs this right now because that is what made the discovery so powerful. The strongest proof of character is the proof that appears naturally. The truth that reveals itself without effort. The honesty that exists whether someone is watching or not. So don't question your value. Don't waste your energy trying to force people to see who you are. The people who are meant to understand your heart will eventually discover the truth for themselves. And listen to this, that is exactly what happened here. They went searching for answers and found something they never expected. They found authenticity. They found sincerity. They found a reason to believe again. And as they move forward with that realization, one thing is becoming clearer every day. The truth they discovered about you is something they will never be able to forget.